if you've ever even thought, I'd like to do that, come to Wellington Access Radio and say, oh, well, I don't know what I'd like to do, but is there something I could do around the station? Or is there some program? And I'm sure Quade, Voice of Aroha, would be more than welcome. People say. My job was helping other people in the community do shows. And my only experience of community radio to that point had been making 6 programs on Wellington Access Radio.
Kia ora, everyone. Today we're having a lovely Victoria in our interview podcast in Voice of Aroha, and with doing this with Rata. You're welcome with us, Victoria.
Welcome.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no worries. We've searched a lot about you and to know more information and to get you, to ask you questions, and it's kind of spying on you, but not really. It's part of our job. Yeah, and I've seen that you do lots of things. So I'll start with asking you, how will you introduce yourself?
Well, if I was doing a show, I would say, tēnā koutou nau mai, welcome to whatever was the name of the show, Ko Victoria Quade aho. And today I'm talking to, so I've been presenting on radio now since, the first show I did for Wellington Access Radio was back in 1982, the second year that Wellington Access Radio existed, although back then it was just called Access Radio because it was the only one in the country. But I didn't really become a community broadcaster until Australia in 1991, when I became a member of 3CR, a community radio station in Melbourne, one of the oldest community radio stations in Australia. And they were very proud of the fact that they were not government-sponsored in any way. They raise all of their money from the community and have been doing so since, I think, the mid to late 70s. So they had a very, very strong culture, and that definitely influenced my own understanding of community radio and what it is and why it's important.
Yeah, lovely.
You kind of touched on that in the end, but what really got you into radio and into kind of dedicating so much of your life to community media and making a difference like that?
Well, I went back to Australia in 1989. I'd lived in New Zealand for 10 years. I went to university here and I worked here for TVNZ. So I was in the media. I was a film and video editor. And I went back to Australia because I thought, okay, I'm an Australian. I'm going to get jobs in Australia. And the job market was really bad in the film industry when I arrived. So after a while of not getting work, I thought I'll study journalism. So while I was studying journalism, I got involved in community TV. And because of my background, I found myself being a peer educator, teaching people about editing. And then my cousin, who is also coincidentally involved in the media, she said, Tori, try community radio. You'll like it. And my only experience of community radio to that point had been making 6 programs on Wellington Access Radio back in 1982. And that was back when Access Radio was just starting out. It started out with the first year, I think they had 3 hours on a Sunday.
Wow.
And then that extended to the weekends, and then it became the weekends and Friday evening. Now, of course, it's 24 hours. Wellington Access Radio frequency shares with some on Capital Radio. But back then, people would come on and they would do a limited number of shows. They wouldn't. They'd apply with a proposal. There were 2 people working for the station. The original coordinators, Cindy Beavis and Pam Fleming. And you'd come in with your proposal and you'd do your shows. All the operators were done by Radio New Zealand operators, and Pam and Cindy were the coordinators. Now there was a feminist show on Wellington Access Radio called Leave Your Dishes in the Sink. It was a sort of a comedy program discussing issues of the day. And the women in the collective who were doing that show wanted to take a break. And I was involved in the women's political scene in Wellington back then. And I think I was newly graduated from university. And so I put my hand up with some other women. And we did a series called Women Making Music, Making Women. Half-hour show. Each show featured music from a different era, starting with work songs, and then blues and folk songs and rock and roll and black music and classical. We had one of the women in the group was a classical pianist, and so she actually played the classical women's recordings, music, because there weren't that many recordings of classical music. So that was back in 82. Then I went off, got a job, Television New Zealand, worked as a film and video editor and a presentation director for 7 years. Then went to Australia, studied journalism, got involved in community broadcasting over there. But decided, actually, I'd come back to New Zealand because my family was here. And so in 92, I applied for the job of development coordinator. It's a part-time job at Wellington Access Radio. By that stage, there was Wellington Access Radio, there was Auckland Access Radio, Plains FM, Christchurch, Dunedin also had a station, and there was one up the top of the North Island, top of the South Island, which is still there. So it wasn't the 11 stations there are now, but I think it was maybe 9. And so I got the job, it was a part-time job. And my job was helping other people in the community do shows. So I was an operator. Back then, all the operation, or most of the operation, was done by station staff. And we produced a newsletter, coordinated the programs, followed up with people, all of those sorts of things. This is what my job was. There was also a program manager and a technical, and another operator, as well as the station manager. So there were 4 people employed at the station. And I mean, I'd come from Melbourne, and in Melbourne, most people were, at 3CR, most people were self-operators. And it took up a lot of time operating for other broadcasters. And I had one lovely, lovely couple who did a music show, and it was death metal. And I don't know if you know about death metal, but it makes death metal alien weaponry. You know alien weaponry?
No.
Well, yeah. So an hour of that was more than I could handle. So I thought, I'll teach you how to operate. And that's how I started. I taught the couple, the very nice couple who did this death metal show, how to operate. And I got really interested in that and got permission from the station manager, because it was actually not, at first, I got criticised for teaching community broadcasters to operate.
Wow, yeah.
But for me, that was part of the empowerment of community broadcasting. Because I think once you've made radio, you have a different relationship with the media. You realize that it's not something out there foreign that's not yours.
Yeah.
And I loved it. I loved helping people tell their stories. Even if I didn't understand the language that their stories were in, you could get the rhythm and, learning how the hand signals. We stayed in the studio the whole time, so it wasn't remote. And I fell in love with community broadcasting. So that was back in '92. And
Cool.
That is beautiful.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you for sharing that. If I want to ask something about the most story or conversation that have been meaningful to you, what would you remember and share with us?
Well, it was really the whole helping people become community broadcasters. And there was another factor in '92. Again, I have to blame my cousin, who at that time was living in Mexico doing a master's, and her background was journalism. And she sent me some information about a conference, and it was the AMARC 5. Now, AMARC stands for Association Mondiale avec Radiodiffuseurs, which means World Association of Community Broadcasters. And so, my cousin was over there, and I thought, why not? I had to get permission from my station manager to take leave because I'd only been in the job for 6 months. But I went over to Mexico, where
nice.
there was this conference of some 300-400 people from 60 different language groups, all doing community radio around the world. And all different. Community radio comes in many shapes and forms. And as I say, I fell in love with it. So that's what I remember, falling in love with the ideal of participatory radio.
Yeah,
And people say now, it's a voice, radio for the people, by the people. That comes from the global movement. That is what it was about. And there were broadcasters from South Africa. Remember, this is back in '92, so it was still apartheid in South Africa, and they did community radio on cassette. They would record their shows on cassettes and take it around to the villages. There were other people doing community radio in places where it was dangerous to be a broadcaster, but they were doing it because it was all about telling stories. So there's no one story to answer your question. There's no one
Lots
story.
of stories.
It's the fact that community broadcasting enables people to have a voice and have that voice heard.
And with the good thing that we have the freedom to share our voices, say whatever we think about. And
Aotearoa is very lucky. I mean, in Aotearoa, community radio is enabled by Section 36C of the Broadcasting Act, which was, I think, I'm not sure the exact date of the latest act, but I think it was 1986. But it says that provision will be made for women, children, ethnic minorities, interest groups to have access to the airwaves. And that's the basis for the funding of access radio in New Zealand. A lot of places, they're still struggling. They don't have that. They don't have that legal protection. And there is some concern at the moment that the basis of the legislation is being re-examined, the Broadcasting Act. And if people don't don't speak out to protect community radio, we could lose it,
Yeah.
or certainly have it restricted. And interestingly, South Africa, which after the fall of apartheid, introduced a 3-tier system, which is better than Australia's, but it is public broadcasting, commercial broadcasting, community broadcasting.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's enshrined in the law, and that's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can tell I've spent a lot of time,
Yeah.
a lot of time studying broadcasting. When my job was for 30 hours a week, and of course I worked 50. So after nearly 3 years, I was burnt out. Also, Wellington Access Radio became independent of Radio New Zealand. When I first started working for Access Radio, it was part of Radio New Zealand. There were very good things about it being independent, but it was also, okay, kids, here are the keys to the car, go off, well, yeah, we haven't checked for the warrant of fitness, and we haven't checked whether you know the road rules. So it was a bit like community radio in Wellington was a bit thrown out. And yeah, it's I think still there are some issues about people get involved in community radio, but the station staff are very supportive, have always been very supportive of all community broadcasters, but there's not a lot of incentive to learn about community broadcasting as a phenomena. People tend to just learn their little bit. Right, that's another sort of thing. But I'm still involved, so I'm still in love with the idea.
Yep.
I think you've shared so much, so many powerful things, Victoria, and it's a huge privilege to have someone who knows the history, but is, you've lived through and, made such waves through community media in New Zealand and Mexico and Australia and kind of...
Yeah. See, interestingly, I don't see that at all. I think that it's the community broadcasters who front up for a show for their community, and they're all very different. There's multiple communities, but it's the people who come and make a show every week, and the passionate broadcasters who are in love with the style of music.
Yeah.
There's the special interest groups who have some message they want to share. I mean, to me, those are the people who are community radio. And yeah, I sort of see it's more I was along for the ride.
And in love with the passion of it, in love with the mission, yeah.
Yeah, you can tell it's still pretty
That's
passionate
beautiful,
about it.
yeah.
I just got a question in mind just before I forgot. Is there any topic or a thing that you want to push people to talk about more, or you really keen to hear it more from others?
On air or community broadcasters?
Let's say community.
In community
the
broadcasters, I think in New Zealand, people are very, very lucky, or access broadcasters are very lucky in Aotearoa to have a station. It's not the government subsidy, the New Zealand On Air subsidy does not pay all the costs, so program makers have to find the money. In New Zealand, that's pretty flexible in that they can find sponsors or get advertisers, or a community group can sponsor a show. I did a show for nearly 10 years called Educating for Social Change, which was an interview format show, mixture of music and conversation, sponsored by the Wellington Workers' Educational Association. And for the last 5 years, I was mostly doing it by myself. But I didn't have to worry about funding because I was being supported by the Wellington Workers' Educational Association. And now I'm one of the presenter-producers for B-Side Stories. And that is a show that is station sponsored because it does that. Its job, its brief, is to focus on interesting people in Wellington doing interesting things. And I think people need to recognize that community radio stations are community organizations. They're also radio stations, and they're a community organization. They need to have the management and the governance. People need to understand that. The money doesn't come from nowhere. You got to find the money. It's expensive. It's a lot cheaper to make good radio, than it is to make television, but it still does cost. And I think those are the kind of conversations I wish people would have. But also future planning, the next generation. One of the things I love about Voice of Aroha and Kadran as the producer is that he is totally committed to building up the crew who does the show, empowering people through education, which is what I got into.
That's right.
You've kind of been talking a little bit about kind of those challenges of, kind of realizing the funding component and the governance component. What do you think the key challenges are for, communities who probably want their voices to be heard and represented, but kind of, getting into community media and making sure those voices are heard? And what do you think those key challenges are from your perspective?
The door is open at most access radio stations. At Wellington Access Radio, the door's open. Anybody could come in and say, I want to do a show. There'll be station staff who will support them to do the show, to get started. I think that there needs to be more ongoing education.
Kind of advertisement of that the door is open. I think a lot of communities don't necessarily know that, so it's good that you're telling the world now. But
the door is open,
but hearing about it might be.
But then, as most people know, you can say, "Oh, well, why didn't you do that?" Because you need your hand held, especially when you start. And that's, as I say, that's one of the things I like about Voice of Aroha. It's a team. The team supports each other. You have expertise, and you share it, and also, I think one of the things I like about Voice of Aroha is it reflects. It's critically reflective. People look at the shows you've done, and you look at your shows, and you say, "Okay, that was okay. What could we do better?"
True.
That's part of the ethos, the kaupapa, if you like, of Voice of Aroha. And I think everybody needs to do that. I mean, I do shows, and I think, okay, it was okay. No, I didn't mess anything up seriously, but I think, I really should have done a little bit more research before I did that interview, or my question line wasn't so great. Or I wasn't listening to what the guest was saying, and that's training. That's training and practice and feedback, and so I think more training, but ongoing training.
That's right.
Can you tell us about some of the training that you've done, both, I guess I'm kind of talking more about your experience. We were chatting before about you wanting to tell people about community media and getting into it, and then talking about how actually that led you into TESOL and to learning about teaching, actually, because it's one thing to know how to do something, it's other people to train people on how to do it.
Yeah, well, when I first started to teach community broadcasters, and I thought, I'm sharing this exciting thing with you. Why aren't you interested? And then I started thinking about how adults learn, what adults need. And you need to have exposure to people doing different things. You need to have support while you're learning. And you need to have a lot of opportunity to practice. And at first, when I first got involved, I thought, oh, well, you just need to identify the things you need to know. That's competency-based education and training. And it's yes, that's true. You need to identify the things you need to know, but then you also need to know when you do it critically. What is it you need to know in this situation? And so all of this time studying education and studying community radio in Australia and what different people did, because that's what I started studying. I went to university in Queensland and spent a long time looking at community radio stations in Australia and New Zealand and talking to people and reading about education of adults, and did that for a long time, and still do. And that's, I think that you have to have a learning culture. And so that's what I think. If there was one thing I think that community radio stations could improve, is to foster that critical learning culture. Are we talking to the people we want to be talking to? What do we need to know to reach a wider audience? And interestingly, in the early days of Access Radio, every program, you were responsible for your own promotion and publicity. So we produced, our little collective of 6 women, we produced a poster, and we did a poster camp around town of women making music, and with the time that it was on Access Radio. We got the start date wrong, but it was a really cool poster, and that kind of thing. Now people do it by voice of mouth, word of mouth rather, and some programs are really successful at it. Voice of Araha does a lot of cross promoting. Black House is one of the current success stories on Access Radio, I think. Other ethnic programs are talking to their communities, so they are in the language that the people want to hear.
Different languages.
In different, especially the different language communities. But there are issues too about how do you get the next generation in, and there's a lot more choice now than there used to be. But if Wellington Access Radio, but community radio in general, is going to survive, it needs to be, I think, a lot more proactive. In saying, well, there are all these other things, but nobody does what we do. And what we do is we support our community broadcasters.
Do you think diversity make it more unique, and especially here in New Zealand, very diverse country?
The diversity of Access Radio, I think you still have to educate people to listen to diverse radio. You have to let people know that they're going to be hearing a lot of different voices. It's done. I mean, that's why the station sponsors programs at the beginning of the B-side stories, but all of the programs that are on the 5 to 6 slot start off with a whole lot of station promos. In fact, that's something I am really proud of, because when I started at Access Radio working, there wasn't any programming before 6 o'clock. And I persuaded the manager at the time to have a community program, which was as a training for volunteers in that sort of 4 to 5 or 5 to, I think it was 5 to 6 time slot. And I'm really glad that's still there.
Thank you for your hard work, Victoria, and making waves. You talked about a little bit. What do you think the role of broadcasting and media, especially in radio, is for the future? And kind of, we talked about creating that culture of change, but what do you think radio's unique point is for its relevance in the future, and where do you think the future lies in terms of media?
So why should there still be broadcasting why should there be broadcasting when anybody can do a podcast out of their
living room
bedroom?
Or whatever,
Because of the community aspect, because you can build a community. Where else would you get together different generations, different ethnicities, different interest groups, different political groups, all can be at a access radio function. People who would not know each other or get to know each other, but learn how to operate new technology, all happening in a community radio environment. I didn't answer your question about the fact that my day job, when I have it, is teaching English as a second language. And I got into that, I think, partly because I spent a lot of time studying education. And one of the things that former community broadcasters said to me was, learning media, learning broadcasting is a bit like learning another language. And so a new language. And I started studying how people learned languages as a way of, was that how I could help support community broadcasters? And then I got interested in language learning as well.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
So that's what I do. And the community radio experience, working with people from a lot of different cultures, meant that I would go into a class and I would be able to establish rapport or a connection with the people there very easily. And being a community broadcaster meant that it was all about telling stories. So what I was doing in teaching English was helping people tell their stories.
That's right.
So the same, very, very closely aligned.
And they all come with different stories from different countries, and all
Everybody's got a story. I mean, look at. I would say to people, who's saying, I couldn't do that. I couldn't interview. And I'd say, look, it's really easy. You just find somebody with something that they're passionate about and ask them a question.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom. We've got one last question. Would you like to ask that, Saha?
If you want to give one advice to our audience, what would that advice would be, like, from
Advice
your
or message?
journey?
Yeah, anything. One last word of wisdom to share.
Well, if you've ever even thought, I'd like to do that, come to Wellington Access Radio and say, I don't know what I'd like to do, but is there something I could do around the station? Or is there some program? And I'm sure Quade, Voice of Aroha, would be more than welcome, people saying
absolutely.
what they could do.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much for your time, Victoria. I'm so sorry we're running out of time, but we could chat for hours and hear about the passion and the wealth of wisdom you have around community media. We have one last question, Voice of Aroha, from our new tradition, if you can pull up the lovely book. So our tradition is each week the previous guest writes a question for the new guest who's coming on. So we don't know the question, you don't know who the guest is, but we'll read out the previous guest's question for you. It's quite a long question.
Okay, and the handwriting as well. So living in a diverse society, such as in New Zealand, what do you think should be the key message that can help us all to live in peace and
mutual respect?
Yeah, mutual respect.
We are all different, but we have things in common. Find what we have in common, respect the differences.
Wow, I love that.
Absolutely agree. That is incredible. Thank you so much for your time, Victoria. Thank you, Saha, for co-hosting, and thank you everyone for listening. It has been an absolute pleasure, and you heard it from Victoria herself. Get involved with community media. Have a lovely rest of your day. Ka kite.